Well, hello everyone and welcome to another very exciting episode here on the MIgardener channel. I'm so excited for this episode because we're going to be talking about raised beds. But not just raised beds, we're going to be talking about 7 benefits to growing in raised beds. So let's get started. The first benefit to raised bed gardening is that you can pick your own soil. This is very obvious, but oftentimes the soil we have in the ground here is not as ideal as it should be for growing a garden. Maybe it's too heavy clay, maybe there's too much silt, maybe there's too much sand, and maybe you just want to have better quality soil with more organic matter. That's going to be one of the biggest benefits of raised beds, because of the fact that unless you double dig your beds, which is a little more complicated than what we did for these beds, but a lot of times people, they just take soil from a big box store, or they'll buy it in bulk and have it delivered, and they'll simply just fill the raised beds, which is what I suggest for beginners. It's much easier, and yes, you get better quality soil than what you would have if you just went in ground. Now, the second benefit to raised beds is increased airflow. Now, a lot of people don't really see how having your beds raised up increases airflow. It's very simple. Every inch that you get your plants off of the ground, there's going to be increased airflow, because the lower your plants are to the ground, the more stagnant the air is. It's just a very simple fact. So if you raise your beds up, let's say these beds are 10 inches. If you raise your beds up 10 inches, that's 10 inches worth of airflow that they would not have had down at basically ground level. If you raise them up a foot, that's going to be better than 10 inches. If you raise them up, let's say 2 feet, that's better than a foot. Now, to a certain extent, it becomes a little overkill, and the pros don't outweigh the cons of having the airflow. But with 10 inches or more, you're going to have adequate airflow that's going to do a lot of things. It's going to cut down on powdery mildew on like tomatoes and cucumbers and a lot of your squashes and stuff that need that airflow to dry the leaves out during the damp periods, or after a rain, or after you water. Another thing that's going to do is it's going to prevent different blights and funguses, because on tomatoes specifically, if water stays on the leaves for a long period of time, what happens is you get something called blight. And that's never a good thing, first of all. But one way you can alleviate that is by getting airflow. So you're going to have less blight problems by simply raising the plants up and getting them to dry out faster. And then another thing with airflow is the fact that if you're doing something like a high intensity garden with different companion plants that are using scents and aromas, different essential oils to deter pests, it really helps to spread those oils throughout the garden. Because if you can have a basil plant and the wind is able to catch that basil and drift that scent throughout the garden, it's going to be much more effective than down at ground level, where it might be effective, but it might not travel as far because the wind can't catch the scent of the basil as much. Now, the third one kind of comes along with kind of picking your own soil and having better quality, but it's increased drainage. Oftentimes, the soil that we have in ground does not drain all that well. Sometimes it's heavy clay, sometimes it's too much silt, and by raising your beds up, you're going to increase the porosity of your soil. The porosity basically means how much water it holds, but not holding on to too much. So if it's very porous, it's going to drain well. It's going to let all that water drain right through the soil, but it's not going to hold on to too much to where the roots are going to rot. So that's a real simple benefit to raised beds, and it's an obvious one because roots don't like to drown. They don't have snorkels. They aren't fish. They're not aquatic plants. So having a drying out period is very important. Now, one that a lot of people often overlook is the simplicity of crop rotation. Oftentimes as gardeners, we want to rotate our crops. It's something that is a good habit to get into. It helps with pest resistance, it helps with disease resistance, and it helps with just making sure that your garden is as healthy as it could be. So one of the big problems that people have is wondering kind of where things go. And they say, well, how do I make sure that I don't plant tomatoes where there was cucumbers, let's say, or tomatoes where there was potatoes? That's a really good example. Or make sure potatoes weren't where potatoes were last year. You want to make sure that when you're rotating your crops, that you actually move them to a different location. And so with raised beds, you can actually physically see the space. The space is defined, the soil is defined. And so you can say, well, this soil had tomatoes growing in it last year. I don't want to plant tomatoes here, so I'm going to plant lettuce here. And it's very easy. And what I call that is basically the modular garden. So modular is a great way to think about it. And the fact that all of our beds are the same size, essentially any bed can be swapped out with any other bed any time of the year. And so that's a real great way to look at a garden, and the benefits is just having it be modular, because I cannot tell you how many times I've kind of gotten overwhelmed and confused about where I had stuff planted from the year before. I had to look back at old videos to say, okay, I had tomatoes there in that specific spot. I don't want to plant them there the next year. So this actually helps me out much, much better because it's just so much more defined. Now, another obvious one that comes along with the soil quality, raised beds, their biggest benefit is the soil quality. Not only can you pick the better soil, not only does the soil drain better, but it doesn't compact as much. Oftentimes people complain about their soil doing what's called caking. That's when the top sheet gets very dry and cracks, and water will not penetrate caked soil. So the problem with that is the fact that once you have caked soil, you actually have to go back and work it over again. With raised beds, you will not have caking, simply because of the fact that you're not compacting the soil. The soil is able to stay loose because you're not stepping on it. You're not running over it with a tiller. You're not running over it with machinery or a wheelbarrow or anything that would compact the soil down. And that's what creates the caking. And so simply by having the better quality soil, you're going to do all those three things all in one. So it's kind of it's a very multi-purpose or multi-benefit, I guess. It's a very multi-benefit thing. So you not only increase the drainage, you not only increase the soil quality, but you also decrease the compaction, which helps with aeration of the soil because roots need oxygen, believe it or not. A lot of people don't realize that, but if you have compacted soil, those roots will not get the oxygen they need, and they also can't get to the water they need, they can't get the nutrients they need, so they're going to be smaller and more anemic and most likely more diseased. They won't produce as much. So it's a real big benefit. That's why I love raised beds so much, is there's so many benefits that are just inherently there. You don't have to do anything different. You just put the dirt in and automatically you've greatened your chances of having a more successful garden. So that gets a thumbs up in my book. Now, another one that might not affect the younger generation like myself, but some of the older generation, some of the baby boomer generation that's just now, getting into gardening or whatever, you're finding out that it's a little tiring on the back. And I know a lot of people comment saying the reason why they grow in raised beds is because they don't have to bend over as much. And that's very simple. When you lift the plants up, you don't have to bend over as far. So that's a great benefit I know a lot of people like about raised beds. And, I personally have not experienced any pain, bending over while gardening, but weeding, I do enjoy not having to bend over as far to weed as well. And the very last benefit to raised bed gardening is you can actually extend your growing season. And I don't know anybody that does not want to do that, especially here in Michigan. You wish you had another week or 2 weeks left in your growing season to ripen those tomatoes or get the end of your fall crop harvested and matured. And raised beds really help with that. Because they're elevated, what happens is that they will actually warm sooner in the spring, meaning you can plant sooner in the springtime, and they will actually frost later in the fall, which means you can get another week or so after the rest of the stuff is died. So ground level, the lowest part usually receives the frost first because the coldest air will settle to the lowest part of the ground. So if you have your plants down at soil level, they're dead. If you have them up, 10, 12 inches, they might be dead depending on how cold it gets that night. But if it's just a very moderate frost, oftentimes I've found 9 times out of 10, my plants are completely unaffected by the frost when stuff down on the ground has been completely toast. So huge benefit there. And you can extend your growing season, like you said, by 2 to 3 weeks, which is great. And I don't know anybody that's complaining with a longer growing season. So there you go. There is 7 benefits to growing in raised beds. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Hopefully you all learned something new. And if you would, let me know in the comments box below how you are growing, if you're growing in raised beds or growing in the ground, or however, let me know. I would be interested to see the different methods that people are choosing and the reasons why they choose them. So anyways, I'll talk to you all later. Hopefully you all having a great day. I'll catch you later. See ya. Bye.